and welcome to the Wicked Podcast. Today I'm here with Gemma Whitehouse. He's a consultant CTO for private equity and venture capital. Hello, Gemma, and thank you for joining me.
Hi, Marcus. Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And as usual, we start at the top, so please tell our listeners who you are and what you do.
So, I'm a consultant, chief technology officer, and I basically go into private equity and venture capital backed businesses to do due diligence assessments, so assessments for investors, and then to work with their portfolio companies on a program, often on a program of improvements, but sometimes to kind of set and form strategy. Um, uh, that's sometimes a kind of product growth or a scaling proposition, or it could be to optimize a particular aspect of their solution or service. So there can be kind of a range, I guess, within that. But yeah, and that's most of my day to day anyway.
Yeah, which is exactly why I have you here because, my background's in change and transformation. I have a different angle to you can call it due diligence, but in my area, it's more called like discovery, where you try to figure out how organization works, what it does, where the value is, and if it works well or not, and what to make of it and what to do about it. So I think there are probably going to be some interesting overlaps and a lot of stuff that I don't know that you know a lot about. So, and therefore, so tell me a little bit more about sort of some of the critical aspects of how due diligence and maybe discovery or due diligence, how you call it, work within the VC and PE context for you? What sort of the reality of what they cover and why and whatnot?
Well, they're two completely different types of investment, and they operate generally at different stages. If you're a VC investor, you might come into a business much earlier, and you've got a longer investment curve often than a private equity business. Private equity tends to invest in already kind of businesses who are a level of maturity, I would guess, and have got to a level of scale. And I would say that the horizons are also different. And that means that in terms of what you're engaged for, that also then changes. So, in terms of the basic mechanics as a CTO and coming into due diligence, of course, you're focused on the technology and the solution, and the aspects which make that or may mean that that is not scalable as a proposition, because they want to be able to see that they're going to hit their targets, that they're going to get that return on their investment, that there isn't any inhibition to that in terms of what has been proposed. But also you'll have to answer key questions like, have they got enough money to get them to the next funding round? And that may be because they want some kind of assessment on whether the kind of roadmap that's been put in front of them by the founding team is realistic or not, actually, to get them to that next sort of investment point and that next objective. Um, but that tends to be the kind of limitations of what you are often asked to do, and I think this is partly because there's no standardization across the industry, so it tends to be down to the individuals to assess what they think is kind of most appropriate. I tend to do a bit more kind of I don't know, contextual work than most CTOs who are doing a due diligence piece might do. So I will look beyond just the solution and look at the other aspects which might affect scaling, and that could be all around kind of the delivery management, the types of people, the skills involved, the kind of whole end-to-end customer and product piece as well. I mean, it depends, of course, the scope on what the investors want to support, and you have to negotiate that with them. But I would say, in terms of differences between VC and PE backed, so the PE investors are much more focused on metrics, and that's because they're coming in at a much later stage generally than a VC might. Um, and they are less focused on talent and team, actually. So they may have a sort of a 4 or 5 year investment kind of curve, averagely, where they will come in, make the improvements to the business, drive the growth, support driving the growth rather, and then they'll be looking to exit. Um, Often for the next fund to come along and take over at that point and cash out at that point. So they're much more focused on hard numbers in that sense. But that's also just about the stage and the trajectory and the nature of the a much more speculative nature, I guess, of venture-backed businesses. Hence, they're very focused on talent.
Mm. And what do you think? And yeah, I'm happy to keep that separation. Obviously, yeah, it makes sense when you say they're very different times and ways of looking at businesses at different phases. So we can keep that. Maybe every answer now is like a two-part answer or two-section answer. So what do you think then? Sort of the biggest pitfalls that you've found so far are when you look at organizations. I know they're complex and whatnot, but what are sort of the things that normally stick out for you that often where you say like, yeah, that's the thing that's more crucial and often a bit not addressed right? Is there anything particular that tends to stick out?
In terms of due diligence, or
Yeah, so the risk areas that maybe come, for example, it's a popular statement that a lot of startups fail because they
mm,
don't look for the right market fit. They think they have a great tech, but it's in search for a problem, right?
mm.
So that would exist for like early startups often. I don't know how that looks for then VC or PE, what you're looking at. What's sort of
I,
your experience in
I
these?
say there's some commonalities, I guess, to the types of problems that I'm often brought in to assess, and that's because I'm coming in at the kind of scaling stage and often the early scaling stage. Um, so um, I think often, if as especially if you're brought in as a sort of fractional or you're brought in as a interim kind of consultant, and they're looking at potentially more support than just the due diligence, it will be often because there has been some issue, something has gone wrong. So then you're having to look at it. You've got to sort of, there's a broader aspect to what you're brought in to assess anyway. I would say the kind of most common pitfalls are trying to scale the sales before you've actually scaled the solution. trying to scale trying to scale the product and the product team, or mature the product and the product team before you've got the solution, the infrastructure to actually support it.
Mm.
That's another very common one. But the other thing I see, and this has kind of surprised me actually, having done a lot of kind of early stage business and worked a lot in this space, is how early the culture is set,
Mm.
and um, and how, and to the extent to which that what you set up at even the kind of seed stage, then with can kind of contextually affects the business way down the line
Wow.
actually. And I think this is kind of interesting because if you think about the evolutionary curve of businesses, especially in VC backed businesses, if they're going through significant scaling, um, there's something extremely inefficient about that. And that's when you get the kind of complexities within operational kind of delivery, where things become very inefficient. And that's, I guess, how you evolve into your wicked problem space. Yeah,
So
because that's when things get really actually difficult to define in a really
yeah.
specific way, and kind of break down and improve on once they get to a significant scale.
Yeah, that's interesting because I see that a lot in change and transformation as well, where the communication sets the culture, or the culture exists, and then maybe through communication or something, you might be able to shift it or grow it or move things around. So it's fascinating when you say like that exists early on. So do you think um, see, in my perception is always that I understand enough that organizations are always complex and they can always be pretty messy, in particular when they grow a lot. So when you say the culture is set early, so are there particular aspects of the culture you see that are more valuable than others, where you say like, well, if these are in place, you can see that the growth can be contained in a healthy way rather than it gets unhinged and it grows, but then after that it can get so messy and ineffective that it will potentially break it. Because I've seen some agencies back during the dot-com era grow so quickly that it
Mhm.
just became unmanageable in terms where suddenly governance and the way where sales were found and what people had to manage, what they have to take care of from a centralized to decentralized move, for example, was just not done well and the culture didn't maintain it. So then a lot of things broke. So what sort of some of the key characteristic aspects there where you say like, well, what have you seen in culture that sort of maybe managed to maintain these things? As much as you said earlier, you often brought in when something goes wrong, so maybe you've just seen one side of that coin.
I think it's an interesting one because culture is driven by people.
Mm,
And if you think about in terms of how people come into most organizations, they only do part of any one journey generally, right? And they're mostly coming in to reinforce what already exists. You're
mm,
brought in to manage what already exists. There's not many people who go on the kind of from 0 to 10 journey,
mm,
right? That's very rare in actual fact. Um, and so most people actually level off also in their roles. Well, on the basis that you're just brought in as a hire to manage a particular scenario, then you're not going to get sort of radical cultural shift, are you? Because
mm,
the whole process reinforces something to be maintained or incrementally built on. Well, then, if you've got a problem early on, people are just going to keep building on that problem to a more or lesser extent, right? So let's say you've been a big corporate executive for whatever reason, and that was your career, and then you've come back into a much smaller organization, and then you maybe don't kind of scale down to being hands on. You bring in a lot of people at an early stage and create a lot of administration. Could
mm,
be one scenario. Or you're a kind of hands-on founder and you just can't actually scale to do the big conceptual destination stuff that the big corporate guy can do, right? You're stuck in that sort of small project, kind of detailed, hands-on level, and you just can't let it go. That creates a culture, that creates problems. And then you hire in people to compensate for those problems. For because that's your kind of level of experience and that's your level of knowledge, and it's not that people don't want to learn or don't want to adapt or don't want to change and don't want the best outcome. They absolutely want those things, but it's often beyond their reach because they don't have that influence, they don't have that support, they don't have that exposure, they don't have that mentorship, all of those aspects. So I think from my own experience, the people aspects drive a good chunk of that. And then you've just got other things like financial mechanisms, not having enough capital, and that
mm.
being cyclic, right? That means you start to build something, start to change something, start to deliver something, and then run out of money. Right, just that on its own can be create sort of poor cycles of change and evolution in the business cycle, so you never really progress as fast as you should, or having to compensate for things you shouldn't have. So all of that is a reinforcing aspect as well. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of layers you can unpick there, certainly.
Yeah, totally. And I think I heard like I was working for one company that basically said, they had picked their CEO for to be a safe CEO for just keeping things together, and then afterwards they would potentially swap it for someone who's a bit more innovative or drives different aspects of it as a character, because company wanted to play safe for the next 2 3 years because they didn't see that there's opportunity to do something else. And that was obviously their decision and their view on it, but it was interesting that they sort of seemingly picked a character that would then create that culture around it. So what is it then you usually do? Is it then that you recommend? Are there any particular things you recommend where you can say, well, I'm looking at this, and basically what you have is, let's say, for example, you have teams that basically they couldn't self-manage because they're just used to that different culture, and it's like this. Would you basically then swap people or retrain, or like what sort of mechanics do you then have at times to at least recommend them? I guess if you do due diligence, you have a look at them, and I assume you go like, well, this is what it is, this is what you want. So these are the gaps, the deltas, or whatever that you want, and here are some propositions. What are sort of some of the mechanics that you think then therefore work? Because I'm sure there's some mechanics that don't work. Training has limitations and so on, and getting the right talent has a limitation depending what industry you work in, depending which company you are in a particular. Facebook's probably easier to hire certain talents that, let's say, other brands that are not that strong, and all of these kind of things you might have. So what are some of the mechanics you usually then go about and facilitate?
So generally you have to be very tactical in terms of your kind of improvements on the solution delivery side. There will be always more to deliver than is actually pragmatically possible within the budget and limitations of the
Yeah.
timeframes you've got. So you've just got to make some priority calls, and make some kind of recommendations based on those kind of tactical approaches in terms of deliverables. I think where you've got underperforming teams, of course, this is more challenging to handle in a way, because you've got so many things that you need to support in order to get them into goal. And it will be a combination of bringing in some externals. So that might be new hires, some new key hires, always senior people, because you need someone who's been there, seen it, done it, can execute pretty quickly, and support and guide others, whether they're external consultants or whether they're just a senior hire. You'll have some aspects of training, and being able to support that, but you're quite right, it has its limitations. There's only so much you can expect people to learn in a short time frame. And then there's some process improvements as well, and just getting people to understand, what the mechanics of certain deliverables are, and having to break things down to these tactical components and supporting them to do that. So there's a kind of number of things that you have to be able to kind of break down, and understand what can be delivered in the short time frame. Because the other thing, which is also pressured about these scenarios, is that you've got to build people's confidence. Actually, you've got to build their ability to believe they can deliver something within this short time frame, and actually see the improvements, because that will motivate them within the job. And I think once you've got that traction, and once you've got a point at which you've actually started to deliver on some of those tactical pieces, that's the point at which you can start to actually build towards more strategic goals, because you've got that confidence, you've got that buy-in from the executives, you've got that buy-in from the team. But to do that as a sort of incoming consultant straight from the get-go, that is, yeah, that would be difficult. That would be difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I can imagine, I think we've both been in those kind of situations where it's really hard to, the trust building come in from the outside, be often considered as an outsider, or sometimes you come into companies that have change or consulting fatigue, and there's
Mm,
another one of those people kind of thing.
mm,
It can be quite tough. Um, on the level of, yeah, there's one quote I'd like to pick up, just because you say you often come in as a fractional CTO and technology, and you take a wider context. So one of the things I came across often is this odd narrative between, IT or the tech side and the business, and sometimes being perceived and communicated often, or referenced as like, oh, it's the us and them, business and that,
mm,
where I've been in a lot of places where one of the main challenges was exactly that, where if those two parties, perceived or not, would come together, they would have very different conversations on what needs to be done. Sometimes even being incentivized differently from leadership, where, example, I think you mentioned sales is like, sales is supposed to sell more, so they need better tools, tech tools, whatever, to provide to potential clients and be flexible. And IT is told to simplify and, take features off and be simple about the tools they're providing, which is often at odds in times unless there's certain alignment. Um, how do you come across these kind of things when you said you work, more in by description in the tech area, and what are sort of some of your experience where you've might seen something similar, and how you would break that down, or kind of have mechanics to overcome these things?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you said that. And I think this is about how the role is perceived. So for me, a CTO role should be an entrepreneurial role, really. It should be an executive role to drive business, and drive business improvement, innovation, with technology. You're applying all those aspects that come from those business components to technology, and advancing kind of leadership in that space. Whereas I think traditionally, and we're very guilty of this particularly in Europe and very much in the UK actually,
Mm.
of seeing technology as a sort of service provider. And then you get a sort of cultural kind of divide between the two, which is difficult to bridge. And also that is most people's professional experience, is
Yeah.
to be okay. These are the demands of the business. These are the demands of the product. This is what I need to serve.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's very much a sort of you're the customer, I'm the service provider kind of mentality. And
Yeah.
it's quite a shift to start to think of it as okay, well, this is what I'm providing with technology, and I'm driving that change and value. And engineering is a creative discipline.
I mean that's really great to saying that. Because would you therefore basically say, and I'm nearly pushing you into a quote right here, you do you really think therefore that IT or tech as a cost point therefore is outdated and should be shifted into a value factor?
I think so. It shouldn't be a cost. It shouldn't be considered a cost center. I don't think. But I've worked in a lot of product-led SaaS businesses. I've done that for many years now. Whether I'm working for somebody else, building my own, or consulting for other people. Um, so, and I think come sitting in that sort of space, you're thinking about leading with technology in that way, right? Whereas I think in more kind of traditional business sectors, that's a much more difficult evolution because they've already got to a size, they've already got to a level of maturity with a sort of concept that this is a service delivery department that's delivering, something that is absolutely critical to their business. But, fundamentally their business is whatever this, thing or service is, right? If you're a big bank, it's banking services or but that whole concept has shifted actually, but yet we haven't lost that mentality in a lot of the business domain. And I think often we're kind of very sector driven, especially in the UK, and I notice this to a certain extent in Europe as well. And I think that reinforces a lot of those ideals actually. So I think if businesses really want to be truly innovative, they need to shift that mindset. There's a lot of talk about transformation, but there's not enough, I think, focus on the idea of that kind of product-led, technology-driven concept and having people come into those sorts of leadership capabilities to drive things forward in that way. That would be really a different kind of mindset, actually, and to find businesses that are in these very traditional sectors that are prepared to do that. I mean, they're few and far between even now, despite that we've got huge, technology giants who have monopolized entire sectors, right? Maybe we wouldn't have if that mindset had actually shifted earlier on, right? There would be more competition for that same space.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think in particular now that we have not just in UK, but generally there seems to be a lot of move around, even the big tech companies cutting down a lot, and I sometimes wonder that how much that means a lot of tech has been commoditized and is expected to be more easily dealt with, as much as there's still massive gaps of digital literacy and whatnot, and ecosystems that are really not up to scratch, and
Mm.
a lot of old system floating about that still haven't been shut down and updated, um, which then actually brings me nearly to, if not actually to my last question, because I always have more questions than time. So given our slightly hard times and all of that together, so we have economically we're more challenged. There's budgets cut left, right, and center.
Mm.
People are supposed to do more with less. I think Microsoft and a few other companies just released articles and statements that they say, we're either going to keep cutting 10% of the workforce year on year till we're in a better space, or at least expect our existing employees to deal with the growth. They are going to be responsible for the growth. And then you have the advent of, not just the advent of AI, which either allegedly is supposed to replace people, or at least, rather, I hope for, and I think that's more likely, elevate exponentially in terms of tooling people so employees can actually really do more a little bit more easily. Because my philosophy is I don't think we're going to get rid of people that quickly because it's just not who's going to maintain all that stuff. What's your sort of one or two points of sort of the future of all of that now? Looking at that dynamic between tech people and maybe the play of AI into that, given that there's more and more restraints than ever on how teams should be effective and the role of technology in organizations.
Um, I think this has been a really interesting one because, on the one hand, this sort of whole Gen AI wave was sort of the promise of another new wave of automation. On the other hand, so far it hasn't actually delivered. And we're seeing a sort of further kind of abstraction of capabilities, which then generates its own problems. So if we're looking at developer tooling, let's say looking at Copilot or one of these other similar sort of solutions, well, they've got quite a high rejection rate by senior engineers in actual fact. And that's because they're not really doing anything significantly more than I might do building my own application anyway,
Yeah.
right? I don't need to automate code snippets, actually. I was relatively efficient with how I had those mapped out on my own
Yeah.
tool set
Most
before Copilot.
most developer tools have a lot of autocomplete and pre-templated stuff in code, and I know that from over 10 years ago. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's generated a lot more errors, and that's generated a lot more code churn and a lot more problems. And you can see that that is also going to be an issue where you apply automation to a lot of these other areas in business as well. The same concept will be true. It'll create some benefits, but it'll also create a lot more inefficiency and problems and enshittification of services in many ways, right? So it's simply naive to think that it is a blanket kind of improvement. And I think it reflects more the kind of speculative nature of technology and the technology market and those knowledge-based sorts of industries than it does actual kind of pragmatic reality. And of course, any capitalist wants to generate more benefits from their existing resource pool and their existing investment, right? That's just the nature of business, and that's just how it works, and that's fine. But the idea that machine learning is going to provide all that benefit on its own, I think, is naive. Yeah,
I think that's a really great statement to make at the end of this, because I think, yeah, it's like there's too many chatters about, oh, it's like this and it's like that, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it's not as good as everyone. The ones who are selling it tell us it is, essentially. And I think that's great to have a bit of a more sobering approach to it. And I really hope organizations do that. If not, then people like you and me probably have to tell them a bit more about that, and that's the case. If not, they're probably gonna will find out very quickly themselves in a hard way. Well, Gemma, this was lovely. Thank you so much for making time and all those insights, and thank you so much for talking to me.
yeah. Thank you for having me.